Here's a little public service announcement before we start this lecture. I do want to remind everyone that when you watch these lectures, you really should be taking notes. The PDFs for the slides will be provided in Canvas right underneath the lecture in the modules, but I strongly recommend to write things down and to take notes. That way, when you go back to take the quizzes and the test, you have all the information right there in front of you with the keywords written down. If you need a little information about how to take notes, remember there is a video in the orientation module. All right, good luck, and I'll see you in just a second. All right, bye. Hi, and welcome to Art History Arts 1303. Before we get started really looking at the history of art, what I would like to do is ask a very simple question, and that is, what is art history? Well, at its most basic, art history is the study of art objects within a historical, social, political, and cultural context. So in other words, it's studying who made the art and where does it fit into the society or the culture that produced it. And so to understand, the art in context and who made it and why it was made, let's sort of break down where art comes from. Now, as most of you know, art is made by, I know this is a big shocker, by artists or architects, designers, craftspeople. Those sort of terms change depending on what kind of art we're looking at, but at its most basic, art is artifice. It is artificial. It is something that is made and constructed, and to do that you have to have a person who makes it, an artist. But in many cases, and in a lot of the time periods that we'll be studying, art is not simply made because the artist wants to make art, but they are commissioned. They are hired to make art for a specific purpose, for a king, for the church, for propaganda purposes, to paint a portrait of somebody. And so for that we have a patron. A patron is a person or an entity. It could be a corporation, it could be a government, that pays for a work of art. Then we also have the culture. The culture is the set of conditions in which the artwork was created. So, in other words, this is the society, their beliefs, their practices, in which an artist or the patrons lived, in which that artwork was created. And so artworks represent the societies, the viewpoints, the ideas, the beliefs, the mores in which they were created. We're also going to be studying the history, of course, of art and art history, imagine that. And the history is, of course, the events affecting the creation, production, perception, and continued experience of an artwork. So, in other words, the history of the painting is not just the conditions that led up to its creation. It's not just about the artist and the patron and the culture that produced it, but also the history of the painting includes what happened to the artwork afterwards. And this in itself can be very intriguing and illuminating, because very often our sort of perceptions of works of art don't come from the artist or the era when they were made, but they come from things that have happened to that painting or that sculpture, or whatever artwork we're looking at, much later. So, for example, the Mona Lisa here. The Mona Lisa, we know as one of the most famous paintings in the world. But the things that made it one of the most famous paintings in the world, the events that happened to it, didn't happen upon its creation in the early 1500s when it was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. No, those happened in the early 20th century when the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre Museum. And the loss of this artwork caused so many people to miss it that it elevated the artwork from, well, a famous painting to the most famous painting ever. It was very much a sort of example of you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And then once the Mona Lisa was stolen and remained missing for around 2 years, all sorts of stories and songs and all sorts of things were written about it and how it was this amazing painting. And then when it was returned, it was sort of celebrated. So it went from a famous painting to the Mona Lisa because of an event that happened hundreds and hundreds of years after it was created. Because we're looking at physical objects, and those stuff can happen to those physical objects through time. So, what do art historians study? Well, art historians study physical evidence. They look at the materials and the age of the work of art. So when examining a work of art, we can determine a lot about it by just the physical qualities of it. We can use techniques like carbon dating to tell how old something is. We can also look at the kinds of materials the artists are using. We know that certain kinds of pigments, for example, were used in certain cultures at certain times. So this helps us understand where a work of art came from. We also can look at documentary evidence. So these are things like records, bills of sale, church records, government records, all those kinds of things, even photographs. We can also look at internal evidence. These are things that we can see in the work of art that helps clue us in to its history. So, for example, looking at the image of the Mona Lisa here, I have a pretty good idea, even if I had never seen this painting before, I would have a pretty good idea that this was from the period called the High Renaissance, because of the fashion that she is wearing, because of the way she is sitting, and other sort of conventions that were common in portraits of the day. But other things like recognizable people or fashion or things like that can clue us in, that are depicted in the work of art, can clue us in where a work of art came from and when it came from. And then there is the stylistic evidence. This is the manner in which it was painted. So, for example, artists in the High Renaissance, their style is going to look different, very different than, say, cartoons of the 1990s, right? They're very different styles. And so I would never confuse, like, Lisa Simpson with the Mona Lisa, because they are done in very, very different styles, right? That's the distinctive manner of the artist or the era. And now all of these, all of these different ways of looking at art and examining where and when art came from don't provide us necessarily a complete picture, but combined they can get us a better idea about the history of the work of art that we are studying. So that's what art historians do, right? We look at the past, we look at these objects, and we try to figure out not only who made them and who commissioned them, but we also try to figure out where they fit into the society that created them and what they meant to those people at that time. As well as we can look at what those works of art meant to people throughout history. So an object that is 1,000 years old could be viewed in different ways within its 1,000-year lifespan. Pretty cool stuff, right? So now that we've talked a little bit about what art history is and how we kind of put art in the context of its history, let's now take a look at the design of a work of art. Because for most of you who are coming into this class, many of you have not had an art appreciation class. Many of you don't have the sort of basic vocabulary you need to describe a work of art. And these are going to be terms that we're going to be looking at and learning throughout the entire semester. So don't think you have to have all of these down right now. You will be quizzed on this, but these are terms we will be revisiting throughout the semester. But I want to make sure that you at least have sort of a basic idea of the foundational words to describe the design of an artwork and to describe what you're looking at when you look at a work of art. So, designers and artists talk about something called the elements of art. The way I like to think of it, an element of art is is this is the basic vocabulary. Because if you think about it, all art, all images, all pictures, all sculptures, whatever, are all designed, right? They are all made up of the same, what we call basic elements of design. All works of art have lines. All works of art have shapes and color and texture and space and time and motion and value. Whether we're looking at a Picasso or we're looking at a Mona Lisa or we're looking at the Nike swoosh, these are all images, and all images, all art is made up of these basic things. All images have line. All images have shape and color. The way I like to think about it is it's sort of like music. In fact, it's a lot like music. If you think about it, all music, and all Western music, all the music we listen to is made up of the same 12 notes, right? It's just how those notes are arranged that makes one song different from another song. It's what instruments those notes are played on that makes one music sound different than another kind of music. But whether you're listening to Beyonce or Beethoven, right? An A flat is an A flat, right? A G chord is a G chord. An E minor is an E minor. It doesn't matter if it's, Bruno Mars or, Bach who's playing it. But what changes that is how those notes were rearranged and what kinds of instruments they're being played on, right? Then we also have something called the principles of art. And these we won't be getting into as much, but these are, think of this as the grammar. If the elements are the vocabulary, if it's what art is made with, the principles are how that vocabulary is arranged in a work of art. So these are things like contrast and balance and unity, variety, rhythm, emphasis, pattern, proportion, and scale. So all works of art are made up of these basic elements and principles. So let's talk about them really quickly. So line, of course, is very basic. In math you learned that a line is a connection between 2 points. But line in art comes in all many shapes and sizes. I think the most common kind of line is what we call a contour line. This is the outer edge or profile of an object, right? But it's not necessarily the complete line or shape. It doesn't have to be a complete outline, but it describes the outer boundaries. You will never use a contour line for shading. It doesn't fill in space, but instead it is simply sort of shows the border or the contour, right, of a form. Contour line. But we can also talk about other kinds of lines. We can talk about lines sometimes that aren't even there. For example, this is an image that is showing us something called an implied line. An implied line, is like a dotted line. It's a line that implies a connection, but doesn't necessarily make that connection, right? Just like the people in this painting they're not touching, they're not connecting, they're not forming an actual line. The line is implied, right? Another kind of line we can look at is the directional line. When we look at a work of art, automatically our eyes will fall on a certain area that the artist wants us to look at, because artists are constantly manipulating us. They are using these elements of design to make us see what they want to see. And so for many of you, your eyes maybe fell directly onto this rower here. It partially did that because of the use of line. Literally this diagonal line, was pointing sort of right at this main figure here. And so directional lines sort of guide our eye. They also show us kind of which direction the action is traveling in. So for example, this oar and the line of the boat point forward, point to the left, and so we feel like everything is moving to the left. Compositional lines are the lines that form the structure of a work of art. So I like to think of this as like the 2x4s behind your drywall. If you broke open your drywall, you'd see a bunch of upright, horizontal, or vertical 2x4s. And art is the same way. Images Sculptures are often composed of line. For example, this image here is composed of a series of mostly horizontal lines, right? That forms the structure of it. But lines can not only form the structure of a work of art, they can also communicate a feeling. For example, vertical lines often are used if the artist wants to show you something that is strong and stable and has authority. Think of the columns on a government building. Horizontal lines can make things feel calm. Think about somebody reclining on a bed. Diagonal lines, like our oar, right, imply movement. They imply that things are in motion. But if you think about it, lines can actually do a lot. Look at these two different works of art. The image on the left is made up of mostly what we would call kind of geometric sorts of shapes and lines. It's mostly horizontals, verticals, and diagonals. And the feeling of this work is, well, rational, calm. I mean, it's basically an abstract drawing, right, of a bunch of shapes and lines. It's not a picture of anything, and yet it feels logical, right? How can it feel logical? Because of the line. Isn't that kind of crazy that a line can imply, can convey an emotion? Look at the image, or a state of mind. Look at the image over here on the right. Look at all of these scratchy, squiggly, sort of curving lines. This, to me, this image feels intense and free and, lively. And yet, once again, it's abstract. It's just a bunch of squiggles. And yet on the right, I have passion and emotion and freedom. And on the left, I have logic and rationality, all just being conveyed with line. Shape and form. Shape is a two-dimensional object, and a three-dimensional object is a form. We, in the art world, sort of talk about two broad categories of shapes and forms. We talk about organic, so things that appear natural, unpredictable, irregular, and geometric shapes that are mathematically regular and precise. So, these are two broad sort of categories. So like a picture of a leaf would be an organic form, and the Great Pyramids of Egypt would be geometric forms, right? You can see that here, right? We have organic forms with this image called a Pietà. We see the Virgin Mary and Christ being held in her arms. These are organic forms. And if you look over here at the sculpture by David Smith, we see, well, very regular, rational kinds of geometric forms, right? Form and relief. So a relief is a work in which forms project from a flat surface. This is a term we're going to use a lot in this class. Relief sculptures are designed to be viewed from only one side, right? You can't really walk around them because they're usually projecting from a wall. High relief is a carved panel where the figures project a great deal of depth. So like the image here from ancient Rome of the Areopagus here, this is what we would call a high relief. The image on the right is, you could call it a low relief, but in this class, we're going to use the term bas. That is spelled B-A-S. It's a French term. It simply means low relief in French, but we're going to be using that term a lot. I might say low relief, but if you hear bas relief, I just mean low relief. We got to use the fancy art terms in this class. It's mandatory, and you got to say it with your pinky in the air. You don't have to do that. A sculpture in the round or a form in the round is a freestanding sculpture, meaning you can walk all the way around it. It's meant to be viewed from multiple angles, if not all angles, right? That's sculpture in the round or form in the round. Texture, of course, is another basic element of art. Texture is the surface quality of something. It's, we use words like rough and smooth, hard and soft, hot and cold. These describe the surface quality of something. And so in a sculpture, we have actual texture, right? We have real texture. If I touched this sculpture, it would feel, well, you would guess, right? It would feel hard. In the summer, it would feel hot, right? In the winter, it would feel cold. The image on the right, the base of the sculpture would feel rough. The bodies of the figures kissing would feel smooth. But with two-dimensional images, so with paintings, with photographs, texture is not real. It is not actual texture, but it is implied texture. So for example, looking at this image of the horse, what I see, my eyes see a glossy, smooth coat. It sees a bushy tail and mane. It sees a wet nose and hard hooves. But if I reached out and touched it, all I would feel, well, first I would feel a security guard pulling my hand away because you're not supposed to touch paintings in museums. But also I would feel paint. I would feel just the texture of the paint in the canvas. I wouldn't feel what I see, because here's a little secret that we're just going to get out of the way at the very beginning of the class. Art is a lie. The whole goal of art is, well, the whole goal of a lot of art is to make us believe that we are seeing something that we're actually not. I see a horse, but there's actually not a horse here, right? It's paint on a canvas. I am being lied to, and I'm believing that lie. And the texture helps sell it, right? I think that coat looks glossy, so that makes it more believable to me. So images are a lie, guys. They are not telling us the truth. Artists are often trying to convince us we're seeing something we're not. Like in this very famous image called The Treachery of Images, a painting by the artist René Magritte, which very famously says in French, "This is not a pipe." It is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. It's paint on a canvas that looks like a pipe. But pictures constantly lie to us. It's something important. It's something to think about. It's something to realize this early on. So artists make us believe things aren't there through things like texture. Also, something called value, space, and perspective are often used to convince us that something is real and it's three-dimensional when it's actually a flat image. So value, of course, is lightness and darkness. Value refers to basically shades of gray, light and dark on the extremes with shades of gray in between. Values can be used to create shadow. It can be used to create the feeling that you are looking at a three-dimensional form. Space is another one. We have what we call compositional space and illusionistic space. So let's look at compositional space. This is basically just positive and negative, or put it even more simply, empty and full. For example, this painting here has a lot of what we call negative space, this big empty area above the figure here. Now, artists often use negative and positive space to help convey a feeling, just like they use all of these elements. Like an artist can convey calmness or excitement using simply something as simple as line. Look at this painting. What is the feeling you get from this painting? If you feel loneliness or emptiness, well, that's because the artist used a lot of negative space. This is a very famous image of a very famous assassination. And the artist wanted to show us the loneliness of this man. You can even see the knife down here. After he was mortally wounded and he's now dead. He wanted to convey the loneliness of this man's death. And one way he is doing that is by literally giving us emptiness above the figure here, this use of negative space. Now, another way of creating a feeling of space is by creating the illusion of depth. This is called perspective. We live, of course, in a three-dimensional world, but a lot of art, paintings and photographs, those kinds of things, are two-dimensional. They don't have depth. And so how does an artist take something that is inherently flat, and give it the feeling that it has depth. They do this with perspective, and there's different kinds of perspective. There's something called atmospheric perspective, which means that distant objects lack contrast, detail, and sharpness. They're out of focus because, well, air is not completely transparent. So this means that objects that are further away appear less detailed. They appear hazier and foggier. Objects take on a kind of a blue-gray middle value as they get further away. You can see that demonstrated here in this image, but also here. Notice the rocks and the cliff sides appear much more in focus, and the colors are much deeper and what we say more saturated than they are further away. This is atmospheric perspective. It creates the illusion of an atmosphere. Another tool is called one-point perspective, and this is something we won't be seeing a whole lot in this class because, except for a few exceptions, one-point perspective wasn't really invented. It wasn't really widely used. But this is an illusion that was developed, well, over a long period of time, but really brought into popularity during the Italian Renaissance. So this is beyond the scope of this class. But it is basically a mathematical system that uses a horizon line and a vanishing point to create this realistic three-dimensional view. This is something we won't be looking at a whole lot this semester, but it is something that once you know what it is, you'll start seeing over and over and over again. Foreshortening is another kind of perspective. It's sort of an extreme version of linear perspective, but it basically results when the perspective is skewed. So, in other words, things that are very close to us appear massive. Like look at Superman's hand here, and things further away from us appear incredibly small in relation to the things that are close up to us. You see this a lot in comic books because it's really exciting. It looks like Spider-Man or Superman or whoever it is coming right at you. And so stuff that's really large, look, this is foreshortening. Look how big this fist looks next to this fist because I'm foreshortened. All right. Color. This is another major element. Color, of course, is light. It's reflected light. Let me get my little picture out of the way here. I've moved. Okay. It's reflected light. Right? The reason you're seeing blue is because white light, which contains all of the colors of the rainbow, right, is hitting my shirt. My shirt is absorbing all of those colors. So my shirt is absorbing green and red and yellow. But it's reflecting blue, and so you see blue, right? You have little sensors in your eyes, in your retinas, that pick up certain wavelengths. And so those blue wavelengths of light are bouncing into your eyeball, and they are registering as the color blue in your brain. That's as complicated as we're going to get on that. Believe me, it's a lot more complicated than that. Since the late 1800s, artists and designers have often used a device called a color wheel to understand how colors work and how colors mix. This over here on the right is a basic 12-tone color wheel showing us the primary colors. The primary colors are yellow, red, and blue. And these are called primary colors because all other colors are derived from mixing those colors. And those three colors cannot be reduced. Then we also have what are called secondary colors, which are made from primary colors. So you'll notice on the color wheel, the secondary colors are always at the halfway point between the two primaries. So if I mix yellow and blue, I get green. If I mix yellow and red, I get orange, and so forth. So these two primaries mixed will always show a secondary. And color, that's one of the ways color wheels are used. So primary and secondaries. And I could keep mixing and get tertiaries and quadraries, whatever. A term that I'm going to be using a lot, or not a lot, but a term I will be using sometimes is called subtractive mixing. And that is what happens when you mix paint. Because when you mix paint, for example, if I want green paint, I could take blue paint and yellow paint, mix them together and get green. But if I took all the paints together and mixed them all the colors and mixed them together, I would get black. In other words, they would absorb all light. So they would subtract down to black. That's why it's called subtractive mixing. And that's what happens when you mix paint or pigments. You get subtractive mixing and they all turn to black. Color, of course, is very complicated. And I'm going to give you guys a few words to describe specific qualities of color that you will see. So, for example, hue. Hue is just the general classification of a color. So blue, red, green, yellow, these are hues. It's just the general classification as seen in the visible spectrum. Then we have value, which is a measure of lightness and darkness. So you can create different value by adding white or black or gray to a color. So you can have light blue and you can have dark blue and you can have various shades of blues or reds or whatever it is. And then we have the saturation and intensity. And that basically deals with how pure a color is. For example, up at the top, the word color is the C is a very saturated red. That is a very pure red. But if I mixed red with other colors or other lights and darks, then it would become desaturated, right? It would become less pure red. So saturation or intensity, you'll see both terms are used to deal with the purity of a color. Saturation is more common. You see that in photo editing apps and Instagram and things like that. Saturation. So wrapping up here, I want to introduce one final concept to you guys. I want to talk about the words we use to describe what we're seeing when we look at a work of art that is trying to depict something. In other words, the concept of representational and abstract art. So both of these images, both painted by the same artist, Pablo Picasso, by the way, are what we would call representational images. They're both images of a real world person, place, or thing that portray what they're trying to show us in a way that it's still recognizable. So the image on the left is an image of a girl in a church taking communion, and the image on the right is a picture of a woman with a fan. Now, these are very different looking images, though, right? Because the image on the left is very naturalistic or very realistic. It looks very lifelike. So we use the term realistic or naturalistic. But the image on the right is what we would call abstract, meaning that it has been reduced or simplified. So representational art depicts figures and objects so that we recognize what is represented. But abstract art departs from recognizable images from the natural world. Forms may be simplified, distorted, or exaggerated in appearance. Now we're going to wrap things up by looking at what we call representational and abstract art. In other words, both of these images that you're seeing here, both by Pablo Picasso, are images of a woman. Well, technically the image on the left is of a little girl, but they're images of women. Now, this is what we call representational art. Both images represent a real-world person, place, or thing. So the image on the left represents, it is a picture of a girl in a church with other people. The image on the right is an image of a woman with a fan in a chair. Now, you'll notice that both images look very different, though. One is very realistic and one is not. These are where the terms abstract and naturalistic or realistic come in. So, even though both works are representational, abstract art departs from recognizable images from the natural world. Forms may be simplified, distorted, or exaggerated in appearance. So abstract could describe the image here of the woman with the fan. It could also describe this emoji, right? Faces don't look like this. The face has been simplified. It's been turned into a circle, and the eyes have been, and the mouth have been turned into simplified shapes. And yet, both the emoji and the image of the woman with the fan are both representational works of art, right? They represent a woman or a face. So even though they're abstracted, they're still representational. The image of the girl at communion is what we would call naturalistic or realistic, and that's self-explanatory, right? It's art that looks real or natural. It looks like a real thing, or close enough that it is not distorted, right? So those are two terms I want you, or three terms actually, I want you to know. One final term, and this is something we won't really see a lot of in this class, is the concept of non-representational or non-objective art. And this is art that is purely abstract. This is art that is so abstract it doesn't look at all like a real-world person, place, or thing, or a real-world subject. But instead, it is made of abstract shapes and colors. We're not going to see really any work like that in this course. But we will see works that are abstracted, but not completely non-representational. All right, guys, so that's it. That will get us going, and I will see you all in the next lecture. All right, bye.